I just wanted to begin by dedicating this tribute to John Craxton to a great friend of his, who was Sinclair Hood, former director of the British School at Athens, who died recently just short of his 104th birthday. They were great enthusiasts, great Philhellenes, and great mates. Now, Sinclair loved the hands-on business of archaeology. He loved the digging and the discovery. He wasn't so keen on writing up the notes. And John Craxton was the same. He loved the living the life he put into his pictures. He loved painting his pictures. He wasn't so keen on finishing the pictures or showing the pictures or selling the pictures. So they were two enthusiasts, greatly erudite, and also they had this great sense of fun. It's just sort of people you would like to spend an evening in a taverna with, or many evenings in many tavernas. So it gives me great pleasure, and it's an honour to be able to dedicate this tribute to John Craxton to his friend Sinclair Hood. Now we have a presentation we recorded earlier.
My Life of John Craxton is being published on the 75th anniversary of his arrival in Athens in May 1946. He was 23 and securing a lifelong dream to live and work in Greece. He secured that dream and was not disappointed. He lived a life of pleasure and he painted it too. His life was a journey from darkness into light and from monochrome into colour. And here you see him in the image on the book jacket, in a picture painted soon after his arrival and embarking on a life of adventure. We met at a funeral in January 2000 and he completely took over my life. I became his assistant in many ways and begged to write his biography. He refused, as he'd refused all approaches since 1948, but I kept notes in secret, I confess. And finally, around 2006, he conceded that I could write this book, and we then conducted many interviews before his death in November 2009. I wanted to call the book A Life of Gifts because John was superbly talented and supremely fortunate. And also, for much of his life, he lived on very little, handouts from friends and patrons when he was unable to sell his pictures. And then also, he was best known, when known at all for many decades, as the designer of book jackets for his friend Patrick Leigh Fermor, and this title plays to the best of them, I think, A Time of Gifts. John was born on Tuesday, 3rd of October 1922 in the St John's Wood district of London. He was one of 6 children in an intensely happy and musical family. The house, almost visible in the top right-hand corner of this photograph, was shared with gifted but penniless musical students and all kinds of waifs and strays. And there was a clear view from the back garden over cricket matches, but John was the only member of the household who wasn't interested in cricket. He wasn't interested in sport, and he wasn't interested in any kind of organised team activity. He was absolutely and always a solo player. No one in the happy Craxton family knew that in the Greek world a Tuesday birth was a bad omen, as it had been ever since Tuesday, 29th of May 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. During that first October week of 1922, British newspapers were reporting another dire Tuesday for Hellenic history. In the latest conflict with the Turks, Greeks were being driven out of Asia Minor, where they'd lived since ancient times. Smyrna was a smoking ruin. A peace conference from the 3rd of October would kill Greek hopes of reclaiming Constantinople and lead to a vast exchange of populations, Greek and Turk, Christian and Muslim, in opposing tides of matching human misery. John was the 4th of 5 sons before his beloved parents, Harold and Essie, got the daughter they'd wanted all along. Here we see the family in a photograph from the mid-1930s, Harold holding on to Essie's arm, and then their children as unalike as a bus-queue. Tim, who became a Spitfire pilot, Anthony, a BBC producer, Robin, an engineer, John, a painter, Michael, a politician, and Janet, the leading oboist of her generation and John's best-loved sibling. Short of space and money, Harold and Essie were only too glad to send their children away. They went armed with a spirit of adventure and the knowledge that they were loved and could always return. But by modern standards they were neglected at times, if not actually forgotten. All became daredevils and rebels, and John was a total tearaway. He crashed out of 7 or 8 schools. He couldn't remember how many exactly, but was adamant that he'd always walked out before being kicked out. He left school with no formal qualifications, not even in art. By his mid-teens, he was living with an uncle and aunt, artists both, in an unmodernised Dorset cottage. Bim and Amy Waller lived next to nature and amid the unspoilt landscapes of Cranbourne Chase, rich in archaeology and mythology, and for John a first stepping stone to Greece. Best of all, John was a short walk from the Pitt Rivers Museum at Farnham. Amid archaeological and ethnographical treasures from all over the planet, he found he loved art from the ancient Greek world best. Marble Cycladic figures, Minoan pots, painted Fayum coffin portraits from Roman-era Egypt. Both the pieces pictured here, now in the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich, had a big influence on his later art. This bit of luck was typical. When John had discovered his lifelong love of archaeology, Essie Craxton had called a friend, and soon her son was helping Mortimer Wheeler to uncover a Roman mosaic pavement at St Albans. The helper was 8 years old. John had stayed at school just long enough to be taken under the wing of the fathers of 2 fellow pupils. One was the sculptor Eric Kennington, whose art made heroes of ordinary people. The other was collector Mark Oliver, who introduced him to the work of El Greco, at once and forever his favourite artist, and who took him to Paris when he was 14 to see Picasso's sensational and newly painted Guernica. John had been back in Paris in the summer of 1939 to attend life drawing classes when forced home by approaching war. For 6 long years he was trapped on a besieged island, longing for escape. From 1940, lodging with the archaeologists Stuart and Peggy Piggott on Cranbourne Chase, he depicted Stuart's Neolithic pots found at Critchell Down in Dorset. The wonderful site was being used by the RAF for bombing practice, and this early painting may be a metaphor for danger in wartime. Symbolism in Craxton art is always subtle. Late in 1941, John failed his army medical. He had pleurisy and almost certainly undiagnosed tuberculosis. He needed that hot climate he longed for far more than he ever knew. He went by way of celebration to the National Gallery, and there he bumped into Eric Kennington, who told him that he had to prove himself as an artist worth saving. And so he went home, and over Christmas week of 1941, he produced this, his first masterpiece. It's an emblematic self-portrait, one of many he'd produced during the war. It shows him reading a volume of poems by William Blake while waiting for the outcome of that army medical. It's inspired by Samuel Palmer, his great influence at the time, but it's actually, it reverses the world of Palmer, because this is not a figure finding solace in a bucolic landscape. It's a figure escaping into his own head from the menace in the landscape. And this is a great metaphor for war here. You have a tree which has become a sort of marauding war machine, leaping across the work and lancing a leaf in the corner of the picture. This became a poster image for what was about to be known as the neo-romantic movement. John hated the term, he hated being linked to it, but he is now perceived as a pioneer of it. And then in the first week of 1942, he came up with his second masterpiece. Again, it's an emblematic self-portrait of the artist in wartime. It was actually modelled by a Jewish refugee boy lodging with the Craxtons. And here you see his defensive pose echoed in the tree behind him, which is hugging its branches in a sort of defensive gesture. And the whole image is overseen by this sickle moon, the sickle moon beloved of romantic artists, but in By this point in the war, large moons in clear skies were known as bomber moons because they defied the blackout and let the Luftwaffe in. Now, both these masterly drawings were picked up by John's great patron of the moment, Peter Watson, who was the funder and co-founder of Horizon magazine, and published in that magazine early in 1942, and they made John's name as a pioneering new artist. While depicting himself as a sad loner, John was actually having a ball. At the end of 1941, he met up with Lucian Freud, and they were instantly bonded. They saw themselves as kindred spirits against every kind of convention. And thanks to Peter Watson, they were able to set up shop at 14 Abercorn Place in a maisonette. John worked on the floor with the balcony, and Lucian lived and painted on the floor above. They could paint there as idiosyncratically as they wished, and that's exactly what they did. And they also were able to roar through wartime London. John and Lucian depicted each other in a variety of guises, and here they are in a 1942 Craxton painting, where John is the poet in the foreground, and Lucian is this very enigmatic figure of the birdcatcher standing behind him. They're in an allegorical landscape of ruins, partly inspired by Dorset and also by Lantony Priory, which in Wales, which John had visited by this point. But I also think John is getting to grips here with his absolutely overwhelming passion for the thought of Greece and the way he imagined it would be when he actually got there. John and Lucian travelled as far as they possibly could, and following in Graham Sutherland's footsteps from 1943, they got as far as Pembrokeshire. And in this stretch of coastal southwest Wales, they just loved the wild landscapes. John came up with pictures like this one: a study in opposites, sunlight and moonlight, wild dog, peacefully sleeping labourer, ancient standing stone and twisted tree. And it's already almost Mediterranean feel, isn't it? And the figure makes this even more so because it's almost certainly modelled on an Italian prisoner of war, an unlikely symbol of freedom at that point, but very much a Craxton gesture. And John was happy in this landscape until Peter Watson said to him that for all its pared back splendour, it could only be a pale imitation of Greece. And after that, John was even more determined to get to the real thing. When the long war was finally over, and even though severe restrictions remained, John and Lucian were alerted to the existence of Aegean-like islands off the coast of Cornwall, and so in August 1945 they went to the Isles of Scilly, and John was basking by this time in the influences of Miro and Picasso, and he had this completely sunburst reaction to this Greek-like landscape. And it was altogether wonderful and nothing like enough. And the two young painters befriended the crews of Breton fishing boats in the harbour and managed to stow away twice on fishing boats, longing to get to Paris and Picasso and then on to the south. But they got no further than Penzance before being discovered and evicted. John finally escaped the following spring via an exhibition in Zurich. At the opening dinner, he was seated next to Lady Norton, wife of the British ambassador to Athens, who was on a mission to buy curtains for the threadbare embassy and had parked a borrowed bomber in Milan. She offered the charmer a lift. The ambassador was less delighted to see him, and so he was soon heading to his first Greek island, Poros. His first Greek landscape, Hotel by the Sea, was painted in the ecstasy of arrival. The so-called hotel is actually based on the Villa Serenity, which John could see from his lodgings and where he was about to meet the poet George Seferis. The pared-down building in the painting also carries the ghosts of medieval painted churches, which John loved on sight, and the steamer delivering him into paradise. Lucian followed John to Poros that September, and over a 5-month stay, he painted some of the most beautiful pictures of his entire life. John never looked back. They both set to work on images of each other. On the drawing on the left, you can see that John has made this really excellent likeness of Lucian, I think, completed in perhaps half an hour. And on the right, Boy in a Blue Chair was also modelled by Lucian, although none but the sitter and the artist could possibly have guessed it. John took every opportunity to travel all over Greece, and in 1947 jumped at a first chance to visit Crete. He had 3 reasons for doing so. The first was to track down the birthplace of El Greco, the second was to see the palace of Knossos, and the third was to be reunited with the star dancer from the sailors' bars of Poros, who was now demobbed and back to being a butcher in Heraclean market. John met up with the butcher and they arranged to meet that evening, and then he caught a bus to Knossos. He walked through the ruined gardens of Sir Arthur Evans's Villa Ariadne and climbed the entrance steps still guarded by the headless statue of Hadrian, though the latest military occupants had been the last of the German forces to surrender in 1945. The palace of the Knossos excavator was now returned to the care of the British School at Athens, and John was able to spend the night on an abandoned army bed. In a land of heroes, none now loomed larger than John Pendlebury, the Knossos director and resistance leader, captured and executed by the Germans in 1941. It was another lucky break for John Craxton that they shared a first name. That evening, John met Costa, the dancing butcher, in a nearby taverna, and he did his trademark dance, the Zybekico. And this was where he danced around an upturned chair, and then with a firm forward thrust, he grabbed the top 2 legs and somersaulted backwards over the chair to land cleanly on his feet and continue dancing. It was an amazing performance. John said, "Painted cut-out tin rabbits that were placed strategically around the outer fence were riddled with bullet holes. Costa, among others, shot a few of them as the evening progressed, as well as dancing his acrobatic dance only a few yards from the palace of Knossos. After I left to sleep in the villa, the music and the shooting went on all night. In Crete in those days after the war, it was quite normal for every man to carry a gun, and after a few tumblers of wine to suddenly go bang, bang, bang. Well, something went bang in John's brain when poring over Knossos material in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum. A Minoan gold seal ring, decorated with a bull-leaping scene, bore an amazing and uncanny likeness to the butcher's dance with the upturned chair he had watched on Poros and Crete and recorded in a painting. Now he knew for certain that he had witnessed a folk survival over 4 millennia. In 1948, John painted this magnificent picture as a tribute to his patron Peter Watson. It's a formal departure and a new beginning. It's the last of the emblematic self-portraits. Here he's cast himself as a shepherd playing the pipe. He'd just learnt to play the penny whistle. It's also a reference to Pan and to the shepherds whose company he was now so enjoying on annual visits to the White Mountains of Crete. And here you can see how he's applied a form of cubism to suit the angular nature of the Greek landscape, and within the jagged geometry of this picture he has built trees and this flock of goats, and it's really suiting his purposes as a painter. Henceforward, John was an enthusiastic and extremely accomplished portraitist of other people. These 4 drawings illustrated here were all bought by Peter Pears, the singer and partner of the composer Benjamin Britten. And they show John's talent, I think, very well. He would capture these likenesses in 20 or 30 minutes, and he said it was almost as though he'd become a camera. When he went to Greece, he felt he wasn't really a draftsman, but in Greece it all changed. He opened up, the landscape opened him up, the life opened him up. And partly because Greek people so liked to sit for their portraits, he just felt liberated and he became friends of all these sitters. He went to Crete in search of the resistance comrades of Patrick Leigh Fermor, and he made an entirely new set of friends. Here's another fabulous painting showing John's love of contrast in a picture. Two of the figures pictured here are in light and two are in shadow. And the more you look into this picture, the more you see. You see the flock of goats who've been kept in this mountain cave overnight, being released for milking in the morning. It is a totally majestic picture, painted after one of John's visits to Crete and now to be seen in the Bristol City Art Gallery. While the drawings were executed at speed, the paintings evolved slowly at a distance from their subjects. And early in 1951, John had to put work on 4 figures in a mountain landscape on hold when he was summoned back to London by a call for help from Frederick Ashton, whose new Daphnis and Chloe ballet was due to open at Covent Garden alarmingly soon. Several designers had been considered and rejected, and Ashton was now minded to give the longest saga from ancient Greece a modern Aegean look. John demonstrated Greek dance steps and showed his pictures from tavernas, which Ashton then worked into the programme. This image of a scarf-waving Greek girl at a beach party was immediately adopted for the ballet's star, Margot Fonteyn. John and Margot became instant allies. She helped him design the costumes and chose the brightest for herself. Here they are rehearsing. John has inked in some fig trees for the souvenir snap and added a black cat for good luck. Although increasingly Greek in his outlook, he could never associate a black cat or any other kind of cat with bad luck. He loved them all. Daphnis and Chloe only became a popular success later, but designer, dancer and director were bosom buddies when American benefactors treated them to an Aegean cruise that summer. John slyly manoeuvred for Joan and Paddy Leigh Fermor to be invited too. Margot and Freddie used the ship's rail as a ballet bar, while John and Paddy danced on the beach. There were muddles and mishaps and storms as they sailed between the Peloponnese and the Cyclades, but all of them would look back on that holiday as a highlight of happiness. Joan Leigh Fermor was an excellent photographer, here depicting the tour party on a visit to Bordsey Castle at Nafplion. Without her intelligent support and generosity, Paddy would never have written his books. It was almost certainly Joan who enlisted John for Paddy's book covers. She bought his pictures and sent him cheques when funds were low, as they often were. John and the Leigh Fermors were particularly close to the painter Nico Gica and stayed separately and collectively for blissfully long spells in his ancestral mansion on the lotus-eating island of Idra. Paddy wrote his books there, and John tried to work on his pictures while being diverted by cafe life. For John Craxton, life was more important than art. But it is this atmosphere of humanism and hedonism that lights up his pictures. The warmth of the Aegean and of everyday Greek existence inspired him and fired him. One critic claimed that he was struggling hard against a handicap of happiness. In fact, he was gladly giving himself up to joy and sharing it in his joyful art. But he found it harder and harder to complete a painting, and although he claimed even to enjoy the agonies of creativity, it all added fuel to the view that he was an artist failing to deliver. He worked on this magnificent painting on and off for 15 years before abandoning it as a failure. 3 figures in the setting sun eventually became 2, and they were almost lost in a dazzle of light. Given John's love of contrast, the athlete catching the octopus may be set against the prostrated figure of a disabled former sponge diver. Such beautiful cripples abounded on Hydra in the 1950s. In April 1960, two hopeful young artists caught the ferry from Piraeus to Hydra, one in search of himself, the other looking for John Craxton. The first, a published poet and would-be novelist from Montreal, was called Leonard Cohen. The second was fledgling English painter Christopher Mason. Christopher and John became friends, and it was Christopher who persuaded him that he would never advance his art, given so many social distractions. He then oversaw a move to Crete, always Craxton's favourite island. They found a dilapidated Venetian house on the harbour at Hania. Joan had paid for the move, and John wrote her this letter of thanks, showing the view over water to a working boatyard and a lighthouse styled like a minaret. Of course, for John, the partying continued. On his first night in Hania, he was invited to dinner with Winston Churchill, who had just sailed in on Aristotle Onassis's yacht with Margot Fontaine. They talked painting rather than politics. The second evening, and so many thereafter, were spent in taverna dives with drinkers, diners and dancers. A key attraction of Hania for John Craxton was its proximity to the deep harbour in Suda Bay, bringing waves of brilliantly uniformed sailors. They became his friends, models and lovers. One has been depicted in the painting propped up on this taverna table. For all the fun of the harbour, John was able to complete a series of panoramic pictures based on the topography and sparkling light of Hydra. They owe something to the work of Gica, but show still more the artist's love of Byzantine mosaics. And then in September 1961 came the awful news that the Gica house, seemingly an impregnable fortress, had burned to the ground. On an island of ravishing conservation and restoration, it is still a ruin today. Barbara and Nico Gica were too shocked ever to return, so John went to sort what could be salvaged. He told the Gicas, "The Greek landscape is wonderful, but it makes one realise that the only really important things are people. People can make houses, but houses cannot make people." In wartime London, John had met a young Cypriot actor called Michael Yannis, who had now become the famous Greek film director Michael Kakoyannis. Liking the man and his movies, John helped scout locations on Crete for the 1964 blockbuster Zorba the Greek. He loved socialising with the actors Anthony Quinn and Alan Bates, and the Oscar-winning photographer Walter Lasserly became a lasting friend. But for John, the faults of the Kazantzakis novel were writ large in the movie, and he hated what he saw as a hostile depiction of peasants and priests. John had just helped to save Hania's Venetian harbour from wholesale demolition, but now he saw the success of Zorba, threatening the nature of Greece itself, with the first changes to accommodate mass tourism. John's love of sailors and soldiers, privately and professionally, was sometimes mistaken for an interest in military intelligence. His passion for antiquities was perceived by some as potential pillage, and his stalwart defence of Venetian and Ottoman architecture angered a lot of would-be developers. Plus, he directed an anarchic wit at any figure of authority. So when the police were further empowered by the 1967 coup of the colonels, he was booted out. Distraught in what became a near decade of wandering exile, he settled in Edinburgh and poured feelings of love and dislocation into the design for a vast tapestry whose weaving he then oversaw. Even with such glowing and sparkling colour, landscape with the elements is an elegy for lost life on Crete. By 1977, when John designed his most beautiful book jacket for Patrick Leigh Fermor, the account at long last of a youthful walk across Europe, John was happily back in Greece. Of all the gifts in his life, this was perhaps the greatest. For the next 30 years, he spent more time in his adopted country than in earlier decades, and the final flow of art this inspired may yet be seen as his finest achievement. John never learned to drive a car, but he loved motorbikes. Here he is in the 1980s in the White Mountains of Crete, in a photograph by Nicholas Moore, off to see some shepherd friends. He also kept a motorbike in London, and those of his friends with a strong nerve, such as Freddie Ashton or the poet John Betjeman, became his passengers. But Francis Bacon refused in terror. It wasn't his kind of danger. There's always a time-travelling atmosphere in the art of John Craxton, with ancient and modern sitting side by side. These lunching sailors in a Hania taverna look positively iconic. There's a fabulous complexity in this picture. Look at the patterns of light and shadow, of chair leg and sailor leg beneath the table, plus the elements of a Craxtonian joke, the signed cigarette packet, the dated beer bottle, and the location of Crete on the sailor's cap on the foreground chair. Rather than a biblical text, the scene is overlain with the official warning that breakages are forbidden. The melancholic nostalgia of these conscripted sailors for distant harbours will disappear with a few more drinks. Then the dancing may begin, and afterwards the smashing of plates at the feet of the best dancer. So courtly, so charming, and with each smasher paying for his share of the damage, this band ritual took a lot of shifting. Ancient and modern, mythology and everyday Greek reality, it's all there in a Craxton picture. The painting on the left of a Cretan shepherd was inspired by scenes of wild bull capture on a Minoan gold cup found in a royal tomb of Sparta. And the sailor snoozes in a spring meadow among asphodels which garlanded Persephone when she returned from the underworld to bring an end to winter. The foliage also signifies the Elysian fields, resting place not of mythical heroes or villains, but of ordinary, fallible, but basically good human beings, the company the artists love to keep. The Blue Horse was John's response to a carved headstone admired in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The male head, made in the ancient Syrian city of Palmyra, was clearly inspired by even older Greek art. John bought it in London and, carried to Crete in a rucksack with no thought of certificates and registration, it got him into a lot of trouble, but also influenced his art. It's now safe in the Banaki. Versions of this painting served as an easel blocker in John's last decades. They all add up to an explosion of colour, with the cat and bird suggesting the wild tension within the Greek landscape. And then there's the glory of a rocky world where even stones seem to bloom in spring, along with trees that may be thousands of years old. Loving Greece as the land of metamorphosis, he played endlessly with ideas of cats turning into trees, goats petrifying into rocks, and birds vanishing into thin air. He would have made marvellous mosaics. Like a cat, John had the gift of making himself at home, and he shared his house in Greece with feline company. This late picture, set in the kitchen in Hania and modelled by a single tabby kitten, is a serious study in painterly playfulness. The traditional Cretan chair dances on hexagonal floor tiles based on an ancient design at Olympia. The black cats form a fluid pattern, and the cushion has magically metamorphosed into a fishy skeleton. How lucky were the friends of John Craxton to receive his handmade Christmas cards, even if he almost never got to post them on time. One late delivery came with the message, As acting president of the Better Late Than Never Society, I am sending you this all-purpose Xmas, New Year, birthday, Easter, summer equinox card. This Christmas from 1971 resurfaced for the invitation to John's 80th birthday party. For John Craxton, life was a delightful work in progress. Just as he seemed unable to finish a picture, he loved living in a building site. His ceilings leaked, his walls were zigzagged by earthquake damage, and the unrailed terrace from his studio could have seen less lucky figures plunging into the harbour. The house is more secure now, but retains his spirit. After his death on 17th of November 2009, the day of protest in Greece each year, his ashes were scattered in the harbour. The Craxton Centenary in 2022 will be marked by a touring exhibition starting in Athens at the Banaki Museum in April, moving to Hania in the autumn, and then to Istanbul in early 2023. More venues will be added later.